I'm Washington editor-at-large of The Atlantic. It's so good to be with all of you as we discuss the trials and tribulations in the Middle East. We've got a wonderful panel here with us. Just to my left, we have General John Allen, of course, U.S. Marine Corps retired, but president of the Brookings Institution, former head of ISAF, head of command in Afghanistan. And something about John's profile in the past, which I found so compelling, he was once, as I understand it, commandant at the, is it Naval Academy?
Right.
And there was a point at which teaching Arabic or studying Muslim studies was not done at that institution. John Allen brought that to that institution, and I think made a very big impact, very relevant to today. And of course, we have Carl Bildt, former Swedish Prime Minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs. He's co-chair of the European Council on Foreign Relations and has one of the best Twitter feeds in the world. We then have as well, and we're going to be hearing from him in just a moment, His Excellency Anwar Mohammed Gargash is Minister of State for Foreign Affairs in the United Arab Emirates. And actually hosted me on my very first trip to the Middle East as his home, and I haven't been able to stay away since. So thank you for that great evening, Minister. And then, of course, Catherine Ashton, Chair of the Global Europe Program at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and former High Representative of the European Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy. Very, very good to be with you as well. We're going to ask for an opening provocation on this subject, and I've asked our panel to come loaded with lots of opportunities to critique, applaud, or to just challenge the Minister of State. But Minister of State Gargash, please take the podium and share with us your thoughts.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much. Thank you. I mean, let me begin this talk on stability in the Middle East with a description that may help you understand how important stability is to my country, the United Arab Emirates, and how hard we have worked to achieve it. In my home city of Dubai, there's the world's tallest tower, the Burj Khalifa. It cost $1.5 billion to build, and it's a symbol of our country's powerful economy, which with the GDP of $400 billion is the second largest in the Middle East. That economy increasingly depends on tourism, services, and trade, as we make full use of our location in the region. We hosted around 20 million tourists and visitors last year, and we're the biggest exporter in the Arab world. Both tourism and trade need stability to flourish. Yet from the top of that tall tower, it's possible to see the coast of Iran, less than 200 kilometers to the north. In fact, it is possible to see where Iran smuggles weapons to Yemen. We are within range of every one of Iran's missiles. You may imagine, therefore, that we want peaceful solutions to the many problems of our region. We in the United Arab Emirates have built for ourselves something precious and rare in the Middle East, functioning state and functioning economy that's not buffeted by the winds of globalization, but instead is harnessing them, a nation which is becoming ever better educated, more attuned to a wider world, and people who resist sectarianism can live comfortably with those of other religions or no religion at all. Yet, as we look around us, we see not only Iran's ballistic missiles, but also the bloodshed of Syria, the violence of Gaza, continued instability in Libya, and a far from stable situation in Iraq, an extremist militia in the capital of Yemen, and great tensions in Lebanon. To quote from the United Nations Arab Human Development Report, the Arab world has 5% of the world's population, but it has witnessed 17% of the world's conflicts in the past 70 years. Suffered in recent years 45% of the world's terrorist attacks, and has 47% of the world's displaced person. Not very comforting numbers. Achieving stability in our region is not a task that we can leave to America or Europe for them to complete it for us. We regional states have to take our future into our own hands. In this new fluid international system, we must go beyond fear. We have a responsibility to find our own solutions to bring peace and stability to the Arab world, And as we see it, there are 7 principles that I want to outline that must guide these solutions if they are going to succeed. First, we all need allies, and we still need allies. Those must include our traditional allies, both the United States and our friends in Europe. The UAE deployed forces in Afghanistan alongside NATO, including soldiers from many states represented here today. It's worked with NATO also in fighting piracy, a mission in support also of stability in Somalia, and we have been contributing partner to various other stabilization missions. But we must also build new relationships and revitalize old ones in this ever-changing international scene. The UAE's relations with India, for example, have been greatly strengthened in the past few years, and I think this is indicative of what we need to do. We must also reinforce the alliances that we have in our region, in our own region. These cannot be merely alliances on paper, summits where countries pretend to agree and then go their own separate ways afterwards. What we have built with Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Egypt, Jordan, and other Arab partners is a coalition of truly like-minded countries. We hope that this alliance will expand to include all our neighbors, but again, it must be a true partnership. Note that our coalition contains not only the Arab world's 2 biggest economies, but also its most populous country, Egypt. 1 in 4 Arabs is Egyptian. No grouping can claim to speak for the Arab world unless it includes Egypt. This coalition of like-minded Arab states is essential. For our second principle for solving our region's problems is that they must be solved internally. We welcome supportive efforts from allies with respect to the sovereignty of the Arab world, but we do not welcome the interference of regional powers, i.e. Iran, Turkey, which set Arab countries against each other or foment instability for the sake of their own interests. Specifically, we see the Arab world is torn and divided because our grouping of like-minded Arab states faces competition and hostility from 2 other alliances put together by outside powers. There is an Islamist group led by Turkey, financed by Qatar, based around the Muslim Brotherhood, and there is an alliance dominated by Iran, with Bashar al-Assad, Hezbollah, and some Iraqi groupings as part of these proxies, of their proxies. Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, addressed a message to Europe in March about Iran's interference in Syria, and he said, it's none of your business. He said that to Europe, it's our region, why are you here? And we Arabs would like to say the same thing to him also. It's none of your business. This is an Arab region. Why are you here? I think using the same sort of rhetoric that he has used. In this context, let me say something about the JCPOA, from which President Trump has recently withdrawn. I recognize the European narrative on the JCPOA. I understand the difficulties that the present situation causes for Europe. But I don't want to really enter into a technical discussion. I'm sure we'll hear more later on with regards to containing Iran's nuclear weapons program. Let me simply say 2 things. First, Iran has a track record of concealment and untruthfulness in its ambition to build a nuclear bomb. I think Prime Minister Netanyahu's presentation in April demonstrated this. It makes it hard for us to believe Iranian assurances of their peaceful intentions. Secondly, Iran interpreted the JCPOA as a recognition of its regional hegemony, and it was emboldened by the JCPOA to expand its influence largely through violent means. An Iranian lawmaker openly boasted that Iran now dominated 4 Arab capitals. This is something that we see as a direct threat to our stability and something we are determined to tackle. So our second principle is that Arabs must solve these Arab problems. The third principle that we see as critical is that solutions for our region cannot be merely aimed at deferring or managing problems, and this is what we have been seeing for many years. We've seen often enough how ineffective this is. the Palestinian issue has not gone away despite 70 years of trying to manage it, and without actually trying to solve it. The tragic bloodshed of recent days and disproportionate use of force by the Israeli army against Palestinian civilians is indicative once more that these issues will not go away. They will not disappear. Indeed, these issues, when left unresolved, create further problems. Just as the Palestinian issue has contributed to the rise of religious extremism, likewise, we've seen also the persistence of the Syrian civil war, and trying to manage it has actually contributed to various things: the rise of ISIS, the Turkish involvement in Syria, and so on and so forth. So clearly we need to move from a mindset that says administer and manage to one that says try and resolve. We must solve these problems instead of deferring a full resolution of our issues with Iran. We hope to solve them comprehensively instead of finding temporary solutions to our fundamental disagreements with Qatar, for example. We want to induce a true change of heart, which will see an end to Qatar using its wealth to support jihadism, to foster instability in our region. So clearly just managing the issue, sweeping it under our oriental carpet doesn't really work. Instead of buying off religious extremists, and as the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has remarked, wasting 30 years of our lives dealing with extremist ideas, we really do need to face these crises, face these issues, and resolve them. Let me be clear, however, and this is our fourth principle, that those solutions must be diplomatic ones where possible. Indeed, looking at the region's history, in these past years, we can see clear failure of diplomacy. If the Geneva talks had succeeded in bringing peace to Syria, hundreds of thousands of lives could have been saved. Libya remains split between warring parties who could have solved their differences through diplomacy. The Yemen war need not have lasted so long if the Houthis had been prepared to engage seriously in diplomacy and had agreed to the deal in Kuwait. We must reinstate the role of diplomacy, and when the next crisis hits our region, we must choose the diplomatic route to solve it. I do not aim this criticism at the UN. I think this is a criticism that we all share, including many of us in the Arab world. In the last few weeks, we've seen 3 elections in our region: a municipal election in Tunisia, parliamentary elections in Lebanon and Iraq. In all cases, participation was very low, and this represented a decline in many cases on previous elections. The examples of Tunisia, Lebanon, and Iraq have not boosted Arab people's belief in democracy as a solution to their problems. Indeed, what we see in repeated iterations of the annual Arab Youth Survey, which examines attitudes among young Arabs across the region, is that the favorite model tends to be the United Arab Emirates, which is a sign that people want, above all, good government, institutions that function, economic opportunities, and the rule of law. So we do need to create a model that works for us. This is why I would argue that our 5th principle should be creating an open and fair model of governance, one that is suited to our historical experiences and our diverse ethnic and religious roots. A sense of stability and order must be accompanied by aspiration towards progress and evolutionary change. Religious government has clearly failed in Iran, in Egypt, and elsewhere in the Arab world and beyond. Some of its proponents try to revive it, disguising it to make it more palatable for Westerners. We must not believe them. We must see religious diversity in our region as a strength rather than a problem to be solved. And this brings me to my 6th problem. Our region is rich with human diversity. Even Sunni Islam has 4 different schools of law. Shia Islam has multiple subdivisions with groups that believe in 5, 7, or 12, or even 24 imams. Lebanon has 18 different recognized religious groups. The Christians alone have 12. And there are others which are unrecognized. In Iraq, Mandians and Yazidis have traditions that date back thousands of years to the era of Babylon and Nineveh. How in such a region can we have governments that are founded on religious ideology, one religious ideology? It doesn't work. We in the UAE are proud of our faith and practice it as rigorously as any other Muslim country. But imagine if we had a political party based on contempt for non-Muslims that had as a foundational belief a view that Muslims must be made superior by law to all others in ways that are incompatible with the diversity of modern society, and that throughout history had attacked other religious groups. These unpleasant characteristics are those of many of the Islamist groups, including the Muslim Brotherhood. And in the UAE, we outlaw this group, and we seek to preserve our region's diversity and to offer reassurances to all that they are welcome. Our measures to criminalize all form of terror finance, our careful monitoring of what is preached in mosques at Friday sermons, our clearly known no-tolerance approach to extremist jihadist groups, all of this is part of how we make our country and our region safer. So among all the bad news that comes from the region, we see it as unequivocally good and positive that Saudi Arabia is now led by a reformist king and a dynamic and open-minded crown prince who wants to modernize their country and similarly take a tough approach towards extremist ideology. This is transformative and with positive implications for our whole region. It's a development of the greatest significance because Saudi Arabia, home of the two holy mosques of Mecca and Medina, where our religion began, has a vast influence on Muslims and within the Arab world and beyond it. Saudi Arabia's success in its present endeavors will bring positive change to the whole Arab world. And this leads me to my final seventh principle. We must offer positive messages to our younger generation. We have 100 million school-age children in the region. 60% of our population are below the age of 30. We must not offer them the tired old narratives of victimhood, hopelessness, emphasizing the difference between us as Arabs or Muslims and the rest of the world, or resisting globalization and failing to harness it. We must instead offer hope, encouragement and vision. The UAE has created in its cabinet positions for a Minister of Youth, a Minister of the Future, Minister for Artificial Intelligence. These are not PR gimmicks. They are appointments intended to make government relevant to a more youthful population, their interests and their aspirations. It's visible reflection of a heartfelt and long-term effort to empower our youth and put them in the fore. This also is what is so positive about the role played, again, as mentioned, Saudi Arabia, by a crown prince who himself belongs to that younger generation. If we have wondered what they would be like, would they be more extreme than their parents, more susceptible to radicalization? Then we see in Prince Mohammed bin Salman the proof that they can be the opposite. He realizes that the old model in Saudi Arabia can no longer work. His plan to encourage Saudis to become entrepreneurs, to build a knowledge economy and open up to the outside investment is what his country needs. Let us hope that other countries can follow the lead. Those are my 7 principles, but let me add one final point to cap all of these. The engagement we want our young people to have with the world is, of course, with India, with Africa, but it is also with Europe, which is likewise a neighbor of the Arab world. Our fates have always been intertwined. They remain so. Violence and instability in our region translates into migration and stability in yours. Extremism in our region spreads quickly to Muslims in Europe. Outside trade and investment in our region mainly comes from Europe. And our friend here, Carl Bildt, has coined a phrase where he said the Middle East is in Europe and Europe is in the Middle East. Greater dialogue with Europe, therefore, is essential if we are to succeed. We need to understand each other better. We need to work together more closely. We need to support each other in a difficult and turbulent period for the sake of stability, not just in the Middle East, but in the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Minister. I also want to mention that we are very happy to take questions by Slido. I think the Slido program has been shown to you, and would encourage you to not be anonymous. Put your name on it. I will give you credit. I want to start actually, just to get us in the business of using Slido, start with a question, because it was the same question I was going to start to Baroness Ashton, and ask Baroness Ashton, after hearing the comments we just heard about Iran and the JCPOA from Minister Gargash, as someone who really was in the Iran business even before the United States entered with fervor. I remember when John Bolton was tasked with sort of communicating to European representatives that while we weren't going to be part of the negotiations and you were going to lead them, he read his statement and mumbled it and refused to read it a second time. There was so much consternation on that side. But just to come to Charles Tannock's question, do you see it surviving the Iran JCPOA despite the regrettable U.S. withdrawal from it, and what are the consequences for wider nuclear non-proliferation globally if it fails? So why don't we start on the Iran question, and a little bit on John Bolton, if you like.
Hello, Charles. It's nice to see you. Can I be Kathy and not Baroness anymore?
Sure.
Don't mind. No, thank you.
I wanted to give him credit for the salutation.
It's very nice, but he knows me better. So can I just begin by saying I thought that was a really interesting speech, Minister.
Thank you.
Congratulations. And actually, I would love a copy of it because I think those principles are extremely important. And for me, I would pick out two of them. One, not sweeping things under the oriental carpet. I thought you were going to say Persian at one point. And the use of diplomacy. Because I think the thrust of what you were saying, which is a region that wants to be in control, to solve its own problems, perhaps with help and support of allies, but to be very determined on its own future, is what I think is absolutely the right way forward. And it brings me to the Iran negotiations and the Iran deal. Not because I'm going to sit here and say the UAE is wrong to worry about Iran. You are right to worry about Iran. There are huge issues and questions about what Iran is doing that need to be addressed. But if you cast your minds back to, well, for me, 4.5 years of negotiating with the Iranians, we were in a position where it was very difficult to have any dialogue on anything, or to try and tackle any other issue until this really burning question of whether there was going to be a nuclear weapon in the region in the hands of Iran was resolved. And so the deal was designed to do one thing, which was to give you confidence that they weren't building one. And the confidence was given. 100% compliance, CIA inspectors, cameras, all kinds of efforts. And although Prime Minister Netanyahu, who has an equal concern about Iran, was keen to show evidence, most of what you saw was evidence that led to the negotiations rather than has happened subsequent to them.
Kathy, can I intervene on that? Why has that been so hard to understand in the communications about what Netanyahu did?
I don't know whether it's been so hard to understand. I think certainly, and understandably, there is a desire to have an ambiguity about when information.
But I just want to point out, Minister Gargash said, because, as Bibi Netanyahu said, we have serious doubts about Iran's intentions.
Yeah, but that's a different question. Right. There are many people who understandably think that Iran might comply now but may not comply tomorrow, which is why the whole regime of supervision and ensuring that they can't do anything without the inspectors knowing, and all the timelines and timeframes. That's why they were so important too. But my point is that that was about diplomacy at work. Your question was, can it survive? It's in a sense in the hands of the other countries who are participants to it. It is not an American deal. It's a deal that is owned by the European countries who participated, and also by China and Russia. And anyone who thinks they didn't play their role should have been there for the 4.5 years I was there, and you would have seen at very particular moments the importance of each nation, and of course of the Europeans collaborating together providing the chairmanship and the coordination of the talks. So I hope it does, because it's a really good example of diplomacy at work. Having said that, I say to my Emirates friends and to my Gulf friends, it was never intended to solve all the problems that you quite rightly are concerned about. It would be completely wrong for that group of countries to try and resolve or engage with the issues of greatest concern to you now, because these are issues you rightly wish to lead on. But it was the Security Council that wanted to resolve the specific question of Iran's behavior as a signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And that's why it stands alone, and it only does what it says on the tin. Doesn't do more, doesn't do less, it just does that. So there isn't, in a sense, a contradiction with what I know is a very strong desire in the region to address these really serious concerns. It will survive if countries can find ways to support their businesses if they wish to do business with Iran. It won't survive if they can't. Simple, in my mind, as that. It's not just about political will, it's about the logistics of actually doing business. And your final point, and I'll be quick, does it affect other things? Well, two ways I think there are issues. Number one, why would other countries partner with the United States of America? I spent 4.5 years of my life doing that. There are plenty of countries who might think now, actually, what's the point? Because if a deal can be reached and then breached within a very short period of time by the United States, why would we partner them? And I think the US will have to find ways to address that. And secondly, if you're the other side of the table and thinking, should I do a deal? You might also hesitate, and that's especially relevant in the context of North Korea, because you're not sure whether the deal will be worth anything in a short period of time. And you will have had to do things, i.e. dismantle your program, which are very visible to your people and are difficult to reverse. I'm sorry that was a bit long, apologies.
Or should a North Korea deal be done, would the next president of the United States come and rip that deal up? So it's not only about the inconsistency of the current time, but what gets built in the, at least in the US side. Carl, I want to jump to you for a moment and ask a question with regard to how you perceive this. We were having a discussion earlier about some of the transatlantic tensions. While this is about the Middle East, what's interesting is when you think about the divide over Gaza, when you think about the transatlantic divide over the JCPOA and Iran, when you look at many of the differences over what's been unfolding in Syria, transatlantic relations look as if they are tattered, in disarray, and in trouble. And I'm interested in how you see this question of trying to get, I mean, we have an impossible job in this session, which is to, the colon of this was achieving lasting stability. And so what is your prescription for Middle East lasting stability, given the fact that many of the key relationships in the world seem to be coming undone?
And I have half an hour?
You have like 2 minutes.
No,
You have 140 characters, 280 now, right? You get more characters on Twitter.
Fine, briefly. I think you're absolutely correct. Transatlantic relationship is in a very, very deep crisis. Middle East is part of that. Not only the other aspect of it, we're going to return to those. I think we have, when I'm in Washington and listen to the administration people, their fundamental approach to the Middle East is different from ours. One of the reasons for that is, as was alluded to, we don't have an ocean between us and the Middle East. The Middle East is part of us, and we are to a certain extent part of the Middle East. We are we have to be careful with this part of the world, because otherwise this part of the world is not going to be very careful with us. That's the reality. Accordingly, what we want to do from the European side is give diplomacy a chance, bridge the differences, solve the problems. If I listen to my American friends from the administration, the new one, their approach is rebalance. You strengthen some and you weaken some in the hope that either you get a new deal or the entire thing breaks in some sort of conflict, and we've got an ocean in between, and we've got an air force that can take care of it, to be slightly polemic. But that's the approach. And from the European angle, that is profoundly dangerous, because I think that particular approach is going to increase the likelihood of further conflicts in the Middle East. And it's not that we have a lack of conflicts in the Middle East, as was alluded to. We have X numbers of ongoing wars. We have more wars going on in the Middle East now than we had for a long time, and I can see a couple of further wars down the road with that particular approach. So we Europeans would like to bridge the difference Israel-Palestine. We would like to bridge the difference between Iran and Saudi Arabia. We would like the Gulf Cooperation Council to come together. We would like to sort out the Yemen issue. I know that this is easier said than done. And we would like to take the even more important thing. We would like to do this in order to concentrate on the really big issue, in my opinion. Because in my opinion, if you take just 3 significant countries, Iran, 85 million people, Saudi Arabia, 30 million people, Egypt, 100 million people, they are all of them on what I would consider an unsustainable trajectory in terms of their social and economic trends, unemployment, growth, possibilities for young people. They need fundamental reform, all of them. And this will only happen if there is a fairly stable external environment. If the external environment is heated up by all sorts of conflicts, internal reform will not happen, and the situation down the road is going to be very much more complicated than it is today.
Carl, do you buy Minister Gargash's framing of some of the positive trends in the Middle East? Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia, the Wall Street Journal just did a profile of his wealth. It looks a little bit like how the Suharto kids got wealthy in Indonesia a long time ago in terms of things that, and they're sort of embedded in some of the comments that the minister shared that Qatar has very dirty hands, we have cleaner hands. I mean, I think part of the question is, does that sort of framing of divide actually work? David Petraeus last week in Abu Dhabi said Qatar and UAE and the Saudis have to get over this divide because we in the United States and frankly Europe can't work cohesively with regional security unless that rift is solved. So I'm just interested, just as, in terms of a friendly critique of the minister's framing, do you agree with it?
Well, I certainly agree with that. I mean, we need to bridge these particular divides, all of them, I would argue. As for internal reform, which I consider essential, yes, Vision 2030 in Saudi Arabia is a daring, necessary, extremely radical vision, but it is a long way to go. It has a long way to go. And President Rouhani in Iran has indicated quite substantial reform packages as well. I would like President Sisi of Egypt to be somewhat more daring as well. They all need to undertake these particular reforms, so we need to sustain it. And there are different parts. I mean, Saudi Arabia might say has the longest way to go. Iran has a more open society by comparison. It's not an open society, but everything is relative in life. It has a more diversified economy. Egypt has more of well, cultural, intellectual talent, you might argue, historically in the Arab world. So they have different starting points, but they have a long way to go, all of them.
Minister, I will give you a chance to respond since I picked on you.
Again, I think you know there's a huge gap between the theoretical framework and between actual what's happening on the ground. I mean, for example, one can come and argue that you do need a dialogue with Iran. And, you know, it makes sense, the neighbor, this and that. The area can't really wait for this schism to grow deeper and so on and so forth. But it's very difficult to do it while you're sending missiles to the Houthis and shooting Saudi Arabia.
Sure.
It's very difficult to do it while you're making sure that you have a transport link, strengthen it every day with Hezbollah. So the problem is, I would say, that you don't have a problem. I mean, all rational people will come and say, of course, we would rather favor diplomacy. We would always favor, building bridges and so on and so forth. But the reality in the neighborhood is that as we say that, there are nasty things that are happening on the ground that need your immediate reaction. And I think at the same time, tactically, you have to work sometimes as and when, because you've got a fire in the House, and you don't really have the option to come and think of introducing some sort of sun energy or something to the House after so I think this is a problem that we do have. We understand the European narrative on Iran, but we also come and say part and parcel of how JCPOA was sold. JCPOA was sold that it will actually enable Iran's more moderate within the regime, and that the more moderate within the regime will ultimately be more influential because of the JCPOA. And of course, I think that there was a lot of naivete about that, and we're paying the price.
Let me, before I jump to General Allen, AKA John, we'll do the same thing with Kathy and John here. What do you think in the next 15 years, do you think there's any chance at all in the next 15 years with you at the helm and other leading Sunni states of any real rapprochement with Iran, or are you going to be in permanent conflict?
No, I think there are several issues we need to look. I mean, 15 years is a long
15 years is a good long time, but do you think it's doable in 15 years?
It's a long time. I think number one is what sort of Iran is going to emerge after Khamenei. Rouhani doesn't really, Rouhani is more of an executive, trying to find power, trying to sort of carve out influence. What will happen vis-a-vis Khamenei? I think Iran today, facing President Trump's position, is much weaker than Iran of 2014 and 2015 because of its domestic economic issues. I mean, we're seeing it. The country is bankrupt.
So I'm hearing a little bit of optimism from you. I'm surprised.
No. I mean, ultimately, what I'm saying is 15 years is a long way. I think our main thing, from an Arab perspective, is to try and get Turkey and Iran out of our region and to try and strengthen the Arab core. I think this will actually give us the ability for countries such as Iran and others to deal with us as equals. And I think this is a problem that we're seeing.
John, you're one of the great commanders of the world. You helped run some of the region at CENTCOM when you were deputy commander there. And I'd love to get your snapshot prognosis. But in the story that I hope you'll tell, I'd like to share that you were an advisor to Hillary Clinton during her campaign and ask you, is this all Donald Trump's fault, what's unfolding in the Middle East?
Thank you. Wow. Well, first, let me say what I should start with, which is to Minister Gagash and our Emirati friends who are here. As having been a commander in Afghanistan, the Emiratis did a magnificent job there. Okay. And it was not just the service of your special operators and the magnificent ability of your pilots, who were truly good, but it was the leadership that the Emirates brought to the coalition, but also the leadership that the Emirates brought to Hamid Karzai in his own struggling with the issues of Islam and how he educates his own people on Islam. So thank you for that. And then thank you also for the hugely outsized role of the Emirates in the most recent conflict against Daesh. It's trite these days to say that any country punches above its weight, but in every possible way the Emirates did, both militarily, but very importantly, and you know this, you and I gave a speech at one of the very earliest conferences on Daesh as we were trying to stop it from getting into Baghdad. The Emirates was extraordinarily helpful on getting to the issue of violent extremism. At the Hadaya Center and other centers that were initiatives of the Emirates made a huge dent and ultimately helped us to get over on the hardest part of this issue, which was the counter-messaging and defeating Daesh in the information sphere. And so thank you for that. The Emirates leadership was extraordinarily important. What was your question?
So my question was a facetious one, but the real part of it, General Allen, is do the leadership decisions of the coming out of this White House matter? Do they affect, or are there structural tectonic issues that whether Hillary Clinton was president today, we would be still discussing incredible disarray in the Middle East? And if I may add, I think a lot of people in the room and around the world don't see a more engaged, robust U.S. foreign policy in the region. They see strategic disengagement and strategic withdrawal. And what you see are nations filling those voids. in various ways and behaving in ways they would never have behaved a decade ago. And so my question to you is, do the leadership decisions matter? And if they do, then maybe they can be reversed. Or are these deeper structural dynamics that aren't related to Donald Trump and his decisions?
Well, I think I've traveled a great deal, and I've met with leaders from around the world, and the broader question is the one, the latter part of your question, is the one I get more, and this is this an administration withdrawal? I'm not talking about the Trump administration, several administrations, or is this now the beginning of what we would call a strategic sag in the structure of the United States? In other words, are we now at a point in our national development where we are structurally incapable? Now, to go to Minister Gargash's point, I absolutely don't believe that. I don't believe that the United States is in a position of structural sag. I think we're in a unique position as a result of this administration, but I don't want to lay the blame for where we are today on this administration. It was several administrations that have delivered us to this point. And there were some key decisions that were made in the last administration, which I think worked to the detriment of the region in particular, and set the conditions for this administration coming in, frankly, absent a coherent policy for the region, to not be able to be any more successful. And so I worry about that. But it's about leadership, to your point. And I do believe that an American leader, and to Minister Gargash's point, an American leader willing to be a partner with our Arab partners in the region, an American leader willing to enter into the broader coalition of states within the region, not to dominate them, but to be a partner with them on matters of stabilization of the region, pushing back on Iran, ensuring that those states that seek to modernize and reform are supported appropriately by American support, which would be uniquely tailored for each one of those countries. I think I can envisage an American leader and an American administration wanting to once again become more engaged in the Middle East, because we can't not be engaged in the Middle East. And our large withdrawal, and you can point to such things as the August 2013 decision by the United States not to bomb the Syrian chemical weapons capabilities, as one of the inflection points for how things went in that entire region. From that moment on, things were different. So I do think it's a leadership issue. It's not a structural issue, and I believe that a leader who is willing to have a comprehensive regional policy and to join our Arab partners in that common vision for where the region can go, I think it's possible. I do not despair of this at all.
Just want to note a bit of news just hit. Several large explosions rocked a military airbase outside the central city of Hama Friday, a monitor said, adding that the cause of blast were not yet clear. Let's talk about Syria just for a moment. I want to go to all of you and either file by Slido or put your hands up, and we'll have some people walk around with microphones. But Minister Gargash, what we haven't discussed here today, you talked about proxy wars, proxy conflicts, and Turkey, Iran. Russia has not come up that much in our discussion yet, but when I was in the UAE last week, Russia dominated the conference that I was at as a topic of concern and presence. And particularly with regard to Syria, but also the UAE has helped do some things with Russia inside Libya. Egypt now has a greater Russia presence in Egypt than before, not often covered in the press. But Russia's encroachment in the Middle East is far beyond Syria today. How do you view, with regard to this question of getting the Middle East right, and particularly with regard to what General John Allen just shared about American engagement, how do you see Russia engagement?
Well, I think, first of all, we approach the international system that it's a changing international system. So meaning that it's a fluid system that hasn't settled yet. And I think we'll see a bigger role for more countries. The United States will remain our most important strategic relationship, but the problem is also there will be other encroachments. And I think Russia and Syria and Russia and Egypt and others is really more about Russia and more about what I would say vacuums that were left, and Russia, I think, use these vacuums very cleverly to try and position itself. It's more about, I think, Russia's view, most importantly, about itself and a return to some sort of global role beyond Europe, I would say. But I think, you know, this is something that is reflective of vacuums of, as General Allen has said, several administrations. It's not one administration.
We're going to take questions now. Robin?
Thank you, Steve. Robin Shepherd, Senior Advisor, Halifax International Security Forum. A question to Minister Gargash and also to General Allen. First of all, Minister Gargash, inside the region, do you have any sense, there's a little bit of popular talk these days that Donald Trump, after Korea, is going to come in and solve Israel-Palestine. Do you have any sense inside the region, from what you're hearing, that the Trump administration is actually actively looking at Israel-Palestine? And the same question to General Allen in the United States. How are you seeing that question from Washington, D.C.?
Sure. Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I just came back from Cairo, which we had Arab foreign ministers meeting yesterday in Cairo. And I think, you know, I have to be very frank, the sense among Arab foreign ministers vis-a-vis the Palestinian issue is a sense of very few options that the Arabs have. So the emphasis is to try and be positive. The emphasis is to emphasize the two-state solution and to emphasize international legality and international consensus that's built over many years. Again, the Palestinian issue is one of those issues where it can go quiet for a while, but it will come up, as we have seen recently, in a very violent manner. I think the Americans are up to now are keeping their plans to themselves, but I'm not very optimistic, to be honest, about what I am seeing regionally. And I think there is a very sort of right-wing liquidist government in Israel that ultimately still believes that much diminished West Bank and Gaza attached to Egypt and attached to Jordan can actually be you know, substitute for the two states solution, and it's not going to work. And I think ultimately, if we go along the same way that we are going currently, there'll be more violence. I mean, there was a lot of argument after President Trump announced the moving the American embassy, and people said, well, you know, there was a numb reaction, there was nothing. And suddenly we see that reaction very violent and delayed. And I think if this continues, I think in 3-4 years, you know, whatever you know, Secretary Kerry said in his final speech will actually be a reality, which the discussion will be, do you actually have a one state, and should that one state be a Jewish state, or should it be a democratic state? And I think this is where the conversation will go.
Minister, before I jump to John, 1 to 10, how would you weight the Palestine issue from a UAE perspective as a priority of yours? Because the view is in the United States that you're already informally negotiating and dealing and discussing things with Israel, and that when it comes to security, the Palestinian issue has sort of fallen what's the real truth?
Well, again, I think since you've used such a crude scale, I'll say a 10.
Okay.
Okay, I'll say a 10. It's essential.
That's a very tweetable moment.
Yeah, it's essential for us. It doesn't mean that we will allow others to use it to put a radical discourse on it. I know that Gulf Arabs are always, you know, blamed if they do, blamed if they don't. But I think for us, it is essential that we deal with it. We're very much supportive of Israel's right to exist as per the Arab plan. And I think for it to arrive there, there are international agreements on various things, a consensus that has been built over the last 30-40 years, and let's not try and undermine all of it.
John, just to reiterate Robin Shepherd's question, it was, after North Korea, is Israel-Palestine the next big thing, and how seriously would you take that?
Well, as you know, I was involved twice with the Arab, or the Palestinian-Israeli issue, and I led the security dialogue with the Palestinians and the Israelis and the Jordanians for about 15 months till the Gaza war ended it. So this is a really important issue to me, and my first meeting with Prime Minister Netanyahu, when I carried my letter of introduction to him from President Obama, I told him that the #1 objective of our efforts was the security of Israel. in the outcome. But I said to him very clearly, and I make this a very clear point as well, our objective as well as the security of Israel was a sovereign, peaceful, and independent Palestine. No question about that. That was an extraordinarily important priority of ours. And our view was, as Minister Gargash said, and I absolutely believe it's the only logical outcome, is that there must be a two-state outcome here. A binational outcome, which is, on any given day, we're not quite sure where the administration is on this, is a recipe for disaster for the Arabs, for the Palestinians, and it will ultimately, in my mind, leave Israel in a position where it is strategically, its viable strategic future is at risk, in my mind. Now, I happen to support a Zionist outcome for Israel. What that means is a Jewish democracy. That's what Zionism is about, a Jewish democracy. There is no reason why they can't pursue that as a political outcome if there's if there is a two-state outcome. Those two states can live together in peace, and there's no reason why not, which is why I did not support the movement of the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem, because there was no crisis that forced us to have to do that. It was a political decision, and in so doing, there was no reciprocal concession on the part of Israel to set the conditions ultimately at the table that could have induced some concession from the Palestinian side to get the talks going. And the problem was, first of all, we've heard no plan come out of the administration. We're not entirely clear that the administration supports either a binational outcome or a two-state outcome, so we've heard no plan. We're 18 months into this administration. We just had this sort of tectonic event occur where incongruously we're pulling the blanket off the State Department symbol on the front of the embassy, and down the street that day 50 Palestinians were shot to death in rioting there, and it was all laid at the feet of Hamas. There was no way to talk about the instigation of this having been this act. So if you're trying to build a momentum ultimately to create the environment in which two-state negotiations can go on, A, we haven't seen a plan. Mm-hmm. B, when the Trump administration says we move the embassy to Jerusalem, that takes Jerusalem off the table. It doesn't take Jerusalem off the table because the expected outcome of the Palestinian capital is East Jerusalem. The United States should remain committed to that as part of the discussions of final status issues. And then a couple more things. The Arab Peace Initiative is a remarkable potential outcome in the event that there could be a normalization of the relationship between Palestine and Israel in a two-state outcome. The Arab Peace Initiative should be something that we never have this conversation about. This was
the peace initiative proposed by King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia, right?
50 Arab Muslim states willing to normalize their relationships with Israel if an outcome of a legitimate two-state outcome occurs. We should always be aware of that is out there. And frankly, I have to say, because I have such great affection for the Arabs with whom I've lived alongside and fought alongside in wars, I was really disappointed at the absence of condemnation of that American move, and in particular, the absence of the condemnation of the killing of the Palestinians over the last several days.
Let me ask Carl and Cathy Ashton a very provocative question that just came in Slido, which I find fascinating. Is Western disengagement and lesser intervention in the Middle East the key to lasting stability in the Middle East? Which is a very interesting question, because some people look at the U.S. role or the European role as one that hasn't always been a good story, that in fact creates its own moral and political hazards, and that perhaps getting to a different equilibrium in the region without all of that intervention might be a healthier thing. But I'd love to get your Carl?
That's a good question, to which I'm not quite certain I have a clear answer. But I mean, I think you got a point. There's a risk that, and I've seen this in other parts of the world that I've been dealing with even more, there's a risk of different actors in the region spending more energy in getting support from far away for their particular positions than dealing with the issues of the region themselves. And this is a balancing act. I mean, that risk is there, and I think we've seen part of that during the last few months or during the period of the Trump administration. At the same time as we can't disengage, particularly also from the US, but I'm talking from the European point of view. We are so intertwined with this region. There's no way we can ever disengage. But we should not pretend that we can sort out the issues or that we are prepared to fight the wars of the region, or that we take action that aggravate the divisions of the region and let ourselves be instrumentalized by those particular interests.
Kathy?
Well, the word intervention's got lots of potential meanings. So I think that for Europeans in the Middle East, the issues and problems that result from particularly wars are felt absolutely in Europe. We see the consequences, we live with the consequences, they have consequences for us. So it's not about disengagement in the sense of not being interested or wanting to be involved, but the intervention word has now brought with it lots of, I think, nuances that I'd prefer not to dwell on. And what I would argue is that we should be partners who are prepared to do things in support of finding solutions, whether that's to mediate, whether that's to support ordinary people who often are the worst affected by what happens, whether that's to promote the values we believe in as the values that we think would best resolve the problem, or whether it's to be prepared to sit down and spend time working on issues. I visited the Palestinian territories and Israel more than I visited anywhere else. I did it very quickly, but I did it in order to try and support the work that might lead to a solution. I agree with what Minister Gargash has said about how the importance of the region engaging in solving the problems of the region. So not interventionist, but a partner.
Right. Right here.
Hello. My name is Ayman Mhanna from Lebanon. I lead the Samir Kassir Foundation. Thank you, Minister Gargash, for outlining that the definition of stability in the UAE is based on rule of law, strong institution, and good governance. And we hope, unfortunately, this is not necessarily how it's understood by other people. Mainly, stability is based on strong men. And also, thank you for your contribution to stability in my country after the late 2007 problems with Prime Minister Hariri. But specifically, are you also getting involved with the other like-minded allies in order to strengthen their respect of rule of law, strong institution, and good governance? And the same thing applies to the Europeans and the Americans. Strong drop in funding for human rights defenders in the region, strong drop in funding for protecting the safety of journalists in the region, silence after what happened during the Egyptian elections and other elections. What level of lack of respect for human rights are we okay with to preserve stability?
Got it. Thank you.
Great.
Minister Gargash.
Well, I think first of all we have to acknowledge the late Samir Kassir, who was murdered in cold blood in Lebanon after Prime Minister Hariri's assassination, and basically he was murdered by the same Hezbollah, etc. Gangs who wanted to silence a very free journalist, and quite a positive force for in Lebanon, really, in intellectual Lebanon. We have to realize that we are a medium-sized country. We realize that we have to have a view, but for us to succeed, we have to go beyond a call for religious sectarianism. The Arab world needs another message. In the last 35 years, the Arab world is basically gone to sort of religious sects and religious approaches to government, etc. And that obviously is failed. So what we're really trying to do, we have to recognize our limits. We are a medium-sized country. This is why it is extremely important to build what I would call an Arab core. And that Arab core has to have Egypt in it, has to have Saudi Arabia in it, but we need to get other countries also. And that core basically is a core to start by not allowing other regional powers to try and influence our politics, to try and take away the emphasis of religious discourse in our politics and go beyond. And I think the UAE tries to, through its own model, to come and say, you can actually work. This is an Arab model that works. It's not perfect. We have a lot of issues here and there, but ultimately it is one that works for the Arab world. Thank you.
Kathy, let me take a question here from Slido directed towards you. You mentioned that the nuclear deal is for the region itself and specifically the GCC. This questioner asks, if so, why weren't GCC countries consulted before signing the deal? Was that true?
It's true. I think in the early days, before your days, I know that, there was an attempt to try and include us in the process. I think it was in the Javier Solana period of the negotiations, and we did not actually get, get the acknowledgement that we should be as part of this. And I think ultimately, if there was that element, the deal would be, or the end result would be on more solid ground.
And I'd like Kathy Ashton to answer as well.
Well, the deal was a UN Security Council agreement, and the mandate came from the Security Council. It was the permanent members of the Security Council, plus Germany, because the original negotiations had begun with European countries. And frankly, there were two different views in the GCC countries. I heard both frequently. One view was, you can't make a deal about our region without us, which is an extremely legitimate position, except we weren't trying to make a deal about the region, we were simply trying to stop them building a bomb. And there was a lot of misinformation that flowed around to suggest that we were going to do things that would affect the region directly, which we were not, except in the context of preventing them from building a nuclear weapon. On the other side of the same argument were many who said, we don't want any part of this, not because we're not very interested, but because we want to be clear that when it comes to another agreement with Iran on other issues, we would expect to be not only leading that, but actually be the only people in the room, which was extremely legitimate too. So in the context of whose deal was it, it belongs to the Security Council. And in the context of, was it a deal that was going to directly affect issues on the ground? Yes, but they could be dealt with by an international consensus, and that seemed to be the best way forward. You can argue back and forth about that. My only comment would be, if you just pull the plug on the thing, I'm not really sure what you do next, and whether the gamble that is being taken, not just in with Iran, but I think also what's happening with the move of the embassy, it's a big gamble that those kind of actions are going to lead to a more liberal approach, if I put it with a small L, from nations, that are going to lead to a greater opportunity for further negotiation, or indeed the rise of the kind of governments we would wish to see. I think it's a huge gamble.
John Allen, before we move on to where I want to go to the Minister on Yemen, I want to discuss another of the big changes in the Middle East, an earthquake that happened just a few days ago, which was the victory of Muqtada al-Sadr in Iraq, which really caught a lot of analysts off guard. And say what you will about al-Sadr, he basically has an arm's length distance, a very pronounced one from Iran. And we have it just raises the issue of blind spots, of things that we just don't see the trends. There are a lot of blind spots that seem to emerge in the Middle East. And I'd just be interested in your take on what you think about that success of al-Sadr, what our approach, whether it's the transatlantic approach, the American approach, but how should folks deal with the rise of our, at least the former enemy of the United States within the Iraqi political system? What do you think the implications are?
It's a very interesting question. You know, when we were fighting in the Al-Anbar province, you remember there was that moment when ultimately, having worked closely with the tribes, they turned on Al-Qaeda, and ultimately many members of Al-Qaeda threw down their weapons and came over. We were faced with the reality that at some point, some large body of individuals who had at one point been Al-Qaeda and now wanted to do something else, we were going to have to work with them. We're in a similar situation now. The Muqtada al-Sadr, and it went Muqtada al-Sadr, Hadi al-Amri, and Haidar al-Abadi. Muqtada al-Sadr is an Arab nationalist. He's Shia, but he's an Arab nationalist, and he does not bode well for Iran. But there's still a lot of animosity and antipathy towards the United States in his camp. The Jaish al-Mahdi, for example, we're going to all have a long time before we get over that. That said, it would have been a disaster, I think, if Hadi al-Amri had come out on top, because he is very clearly a satellite of Qasem Soleimani of the IRGC Quds Force. In fact, they fought shoulder to shoulder against Daesh. Haider al-Abadi has been, I think, a good prime minister. He's tried hard, but he doesn't have, if you will, the wide base of constituency in Iraq, which is inherently necessary to govern. So finding some capacity with Muqtada al-Sadr and Haider al-Abadi to form some form of government, I think, is intriguing. And the United States should, I think it's a mistake for us in the States to say it's Muqtada al-Sadr, we're not going to deal with him. That's a big mistake. Because if, for us, part of our regional strategy is to push back on Iran in many places, creating the political environment where someone who is very clearly oriented on the emergence of Iraq, although we may have to hold our nose in doing this, we should explore ways where an outcome in Iraq leverages this Arab nationalism, ultimately to the detriment of Iranian influence in Iraq. This is perilous, it is complex, it is difficult, but I think this is actually, for me, an opportunity. And we can, because we don't like him, we can dismiss him, and now I think we know where that'll lead us, or we can find some way ultimately with our Arab partners in close conversation with them to find a way forward on this.
Thank you.
And make one other point, if I could. One of the problems that we have right now in the region is so many of our embassies don't have ambassadors. And in the last 2 years, and some of my finest memories of serving alongside foreign service officers on the edge of American influence, they're risking their lives every single day with ours. The leading edge of American influence isn't a 10-carrier strike force. The leading edge of American influence is our diplomacy and our foreign service and our State Department. And in the last 2 years, it has been a real challenge for us. And so when the minister properly says there's an appearance of American withdrawal, I don't know if he said that, but I think most people believe that, we haven't done much to repair that, frankly. And with as many embassies around the world, to include the Korean embassy, where we're about to have talks where there's still not an American ambassador, we have got to do better at that in order to be credible partners with our Arab partners in the region, and for us to have the kinds of conversations where, with our Arab partners, we can have a conversation with our diplomats on what Muqtada al-Sadr's #1 appearance in this recent democratic process, what that really means and how we can achieve opportunity from it.
So not that I'm a spokesman for the State Department of the United States, but the new Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, has just announced last week that he's ended the hiring freeze. So he's looking for talent. If any of you are looking for a job to serve as an ambassador elsewhere, the door is open for consideration. Just real quickly, because I want to get into a lightning round, we're running late. I'm going to go to this gentleman in a minute, but I want to ask the minister about your strategy in Yemen. And with regards to that, because, you know, looking at all sides, you know, a 360-degree view of what's unfolding in the Middle East, again, in your country last week, another of the big themes that came out of the discussions we had was a fear that Iran was involved with really trying to Lebanonize every country in the region. And so Lebanonization, if I may, became one of the catchwords or hashtags of the discussion. But don't you worry at the same time with what we see unfolding in Yemen? You know, you gave an earnest discussion about Yemen, but Yemen to many of us looks like a horrific human crisis and nightmare. So what is your strategy in the region, but real short form?
Well, I think the first thing is this is the first time where you have a major engagement that is totally Arab in Yemen. There is no real American or European role, etc.
So does that make it good?
No, well, this is the new world. This is the new international system. You have to bear the brunt of your own security, and I think that's the main thing that we're saying. And I think our reading was, do we address this issue right now, or do we wait a decade for Iran to build a southern Hezbollah? And I think we came to a conclusion, no, we need to address it now. Now, as we are there, and in military dynamics, nothing goes according to plan. As we are there, I think there are three things we need to do, or there are three aspects to the Yemen crisis. Number one is we are using force to change the calculus, and we're seeing a softer enemy after the killing of President Saleh. We are seeing a softer enemy. Number two is we are not going to succeed in Yemen militarily. The political process led by Martin Griffith, the UN, has to actually succeed in Yemen. And the third thing is, understandably, we are clobbered on the humanitarian side. It's very difficult for states to sort of deflect, let's say, criticism by NGOs, etc., on the humanitarian side. We have to understand that, but what we are trying to do is we are trying to do more and more and more. But understandably, this is not going to get it away. The core thing is to move on the political process, because that will actually solve the whole issue.
That's great. So I'm going to take this gentleman's question. I see some other questions up there, and we're going to go in a lightning round. So fast questions, fast answers. I may grab a couple, but yes, sir, at the end.
Hi, Bart Shevchuk at the European Commission's European Political Strategy Center, and previously at the U.S. State Department's
wow.
staff.
You need an acronym, pal.
I got to listen quick.
The question is, following the EU Leaders Summit over the past 2 days, the European Commission this morning issued a press release about a four-pronged strategy to help preserve the JCPOA, and basically is to help deliver on the economic benefits to Iran. And the question for General Allen and Minister Gargash is, do you think this could work, or is the JCPOA, in your expectations, going to die eventually over 6
Great. So I'm going to hold that one there and take this gentleman right here. Go ahead.
Former Foreign Minister of Turkey. I will not comment on Mr. Gargash's comments, because I disagree with the Middle Eastern policy of my government, despite the fact that I served as Foreign Minister, especially on the fact that Turkey does not have an exit strategy in Syria, especially in Afrin. And secondly, Turkey did not need to get involved in intra-Arab conflict between Qatar and the remainder of the Gulf countries. My question...
Can I ask you a quick question, because you're so interesting? Would you, if you were in power today, handle the Kurdish issue inside Syria differently than your government is?
Very differently, yes. I would have come to negotiate with the Syrian Kurds, something which is agreeable both to Damascus, Turkey, Iran, and the Kurds themselves, rather than pushing the Kurds of the Syria towards PKK. So now I come to the
question. Yeah. And sorry to have slowed you down, but it's so interesting to put you on the spot.
I mean, I happen to be the longest-serving Turkish diplomat in the Middle Eastern countries, so I can disagree.
Sure. So the question?
The question is about the Iran nuclear question. Mr. Gargash said that by imposing harsher sanctions on Iran, perhaps we may move Iran to a position better than before the present JCPOA. Whereas I believe that the...
It's got to be brief, sir.
Yes. Whereas I believe that the resilience of Iranian people is much bigger than we think. For this reason, even if more sanctions are imposed on it, Iranians declared that they will give more emphasis to the more accelerated program for the enrichment of uranium. In this case, we risk a worse situation than the pre-JPCO. What the question is now directed to General Allen. What do you think that whether America will be in a worse position in case Iran resumes the nuclear program?
Thank you. Ebtissam Al-Kebi. It's on.
Ebtissam Al-Kebi from UAE, Emirates Policy Center. My question for the two European panelists, Carl Bildet and Ashton Carter.
All I'm going to ask is lightning speed.
Okay. Towards Iran, it seems that we have different perception. GCC, mainly UAE and Saudi Arabia, and the EU toward GCPOA. From our perspective, this deal did not prevent Iran from developing ballistic missiles, from expanding in the Arab region, from creating militias.
Right.
Now, from your
we really have to go fast, so
okay,
just
from
bullet
your
question.
Which is more dangerous? Is it the nuclear capabilities or Iranian expansions and creating militias in the region?
Oh, great. And I want to take this gentleman, and I'll come back for another round in just a moment. Yes.
Very quickly to Mr.
And tell us who you are.
Dino Jalal from Indonesia, and I come from a country.
So you got my Suharto reference.
Yes.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Good.
I come from a country that used to come up with 1,000 excuses not to embrace full-scale democracy.
Right.
But then we tried it, and it's all okay, and we can't get enough of it. So my question, in response to your point about the Arabs wanting an Arab model, it sounds like an excuse not to embrace full-scale democracy. So my question is, why is it most Arab countries are reluctant to embrace full-scale democracy and prefer partial democracy as couched maybe in the term Arab model democracy?
Terrific question. Really great. The gushing democracy challenge. I love that. So real quickly, we have a couple of questions on Iran, the costs and consequences of the JCPOA, whether it can be preserved with economic benefits, and with regards to what Total just announced, whether that's realistic at this point. Turkey, how to move Turkey, basically, and I think your broader question is on Iran. Does the U.S. lose if the JCPOA ends, General Allen? And does the withdrawing of the JCPOA, the collapse of the JCPOA, Iran just become a self-fulfilling prophecy that will end up, sitting with great nuclear capacity? And we have the democracy question, and we have Iran, and basically the Ebtissam's question on, what should we fear most on Iran? So let me start with Cathy Ashton.
So on what we should fear most, it's great to have a woman ask a question. Thank you very much. What we should fear most, I think you fear both. And I think that the question that I would ask back is how best we know as people, we bring people to the negotiating table. The point of what we were trying to do with Iran was get them into a negotiation that was successful, that they stuck to, that we stuck to, so we could start the next negotiation, precisely on issues like ballistic missiles and precisely on issues about the region. And the argument that by ripping up one you create a more likely scenario to be able to do the rest, I find quite troublesome. A quick word on democracy. The problem often with democratic views is that people think in many parts of the world that democracy is an election. And as I've said in many countries, an election is the cherry on the icing on the cake. And learning to have a democratic system takes a long time. I come from a country that took 700 years to get from what we call Magna Carta to the point where people who look like me and you were allowed to vote. It doesn't come easy, and it's often a difficult and twisting.
It's like Madeleine Albright's new book, where she writes in her book on fascism that most fascists were elected into office. Minister Gargash.
Yes, I think, first of all, quickly on the issue of democracy, if Indonesia is doing well, that's great for Indonesia. We look towards, the largest Muslim country to do well with a system that works for it. I think the problem that we have in our region is this link that democratic processes have come with sectarian undertones in the Arab world. And I think this is the major issue where elections don't really mean anything. I mean, Iraq, no Arab really wants to be, looks at Iraq as a model, you know, whether it's in its corrupt system or in its elections and so on and so forth. I think vis-a-vis Iran, I think one of the things that we are looking at is Iran currently with its back to the wall, doing the typical thing. First of all, trying to play the Europeans against the Americans. And I think the faster and quicker they know that the Europeans are not going to break from the Americans, the better it will be for all of us, because Iran will understand that it will have to relook at the overall relationship.
I just want to intervene there.
I just want to.
I mean, I ask you the question of who are the Americans. You know, Jim Mattis is very frustrated.
Well, again,
so I mean, I'm going to ask you the question of who are the Americans.
I think there is an elected administration right now. You know, and we just talked about democracy.
No, I just want to keep you on your toes.
All right, and I think the other important thing is I want to bring forward again, something that's really, perhaps obscure currently. The UAE actually started a nuclear program, and we took a pledge not to enrich. We took a pledge right from day one that we will not enrich. And I think to a certain extent in an area such as our region, with this sort of violence and with this sort of instability, this is the sort of model we need to look at.
Thank you. Carl.
Well, on the JCPOA again, I mean, let's not forget what it was all about. It was about preventing a war. We were heading for a war. Because there was the perception, in my opinion, somewhat misguided, by the way, that the Iranians were heading for a nuclear weapon. I think that famous presentation by Prime Minister Netanyahu the other week, as a matter of fact, disclosed clearly that the Iranians closed that option down in 2003. But a lot of people believed it was continuing, and if that was the case, we were heading for a war with Iran. We stopped that. We created assurance in terms of the nuclear issues, and then the possibility to move forward with other issues, human rights certainly among them. And I fail to understand, or I can just note, that the American administration can talk to an awful regime like the one in North Korea, but refuses any sort of diplomatic engagement with Iran. That is not logical in any sort of way. And when they are saying now we're going to increase pressure on them, well, what's going to happen? Now, evidently they rely on the Europeans to keep the Iranians in the JCPOA, because where the Iranians restart the nuclear program, there's a risk of all hell breaking loose. Is that in the American interest? Hardly. And if it happens, then I think all bets are off. Of course, we need to address other issues. I don't belong to those that are particularly agitated by the ballistic missiles. I mean, Americans believe that they're developing an ICBM. There's not a single European who's seen signs of that. It's regional missiles. The Saudis got them. Israelis have even more advanced ballistic missiles. And the Iranians have them. And I would say all three have them for deterrent purposes. It doesn't aggravate me that much. But I'm all in favor of, say, a regional missile control arrangement, if we can have that. But that can only be done by talking to the Iranians. And as long as the Americans have a policy of never talking to the Iranians, nothing will be achieved.
John Allen.
Yeah, militias as well,
John Allen.
Well, I think the logic of attempting to firewall the denial through the JCPOA of Iran of a nuclear weapon, apart from broader Iranian regional activity, there was a logic to that. Because if we had attempted to pull all of Iranian activity into a negotiation, we'd still be at the table, or we'd have never gotten to the table. So as Kathy said, rightly so, preventing Iran from having a nuclear weapon was our #1 objective. And we were going to have to deal with Iranian activity with a broader regional strategy in other ways. Now, the outcome of this was a couple things. One was not just the P5, but Germany and the EU were deeply engaged in this, which is a truly remarkable accomplishment. And when you think about how many occasions as an American, how many occasions does Russia, China, and the United States line up on anything? And we just tossed that out the window. it's going to be a long time before that ever occurs again, number one. Number two, if Iran decides ultimately to do a breakout because the European capacity to preserve the JCPOA begins to deteriorate, or that American bombast becomes irresistible and they have to decide to defend themselves, a nuclear weapon in the hands of Iran spells the potential extinction of any number of Arab states in the region or our ally in the region, Israel. That is a very serious problem. The other very serious problem is King Abdullah, in a meeting I was in with King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia before he passed away, he said Saudi Arabia would never be number 2 in a nuclear arms race. So a nuclear arms race with times of flight of missiles of 4 minutes or less with no real escalatory control mechanisms, it's creating a hell of a problem in the region. So to walk away from that and have any reason to expect that Kim Jong-un would be willing to give up all of his nuclear weapons beforehand and ultimately join us when we just tossed out one of the strongest agreements that we could have had to prevent the Iranians from having a nuclear weapon. It is counterintuitive.
Powerful way to end.
And my final point, I was eye deep in the contingency planning to prevent Iran from having a nuclear weapon. We still have that capability.
This gentleman, I owe you a drink. And I have several other the drinks that were giving me both a friendly eye and an evil eye as we on. Look, I think this was a wonderful discussion. General Petraeus said recently the number one principle of approaching the Middle East is never to declare success. We did not succeed in achieving a framework for lasting stability in the Middle East in this discussion, but we did achieve a very candid discussion of many of the factors, the frames, and issues from a much wider purview than I think is usually done. So please thank Cathy Ashton, Anwar Gargash, Carl Bildt, and General John Allen. Thank you all very much. And thank all of you for your questions. And a bit of housekeeping very quickly. Thank you, Ian. Refreshments are available just inside the hotel. Please be back here for the next session in half an hour at 3:30 on President Trump and the transatlantic bond. And at the same time, upstairs at 3:30 in the Maria Teresias, the question is, has populism reached its peak? And in the Habsburg room, the subject is remote-controlled terrorism. Thank you all.